All right, well, hello and welcome to Insight in Action, making your data work for you. I'm Jordan Goslin and I'm a marketing specialist with CARMA. We're a global media intelligence company providing monitoring and integrated analytics around the world. I'm happy you could join us for today's session, where we'll discuss analyzing your organization's data to gather the insight you need to make actionable decisions. Today, I'm joined by our host, Laura Petrolino. Laura is the Chief Client Officer for Arment Dietrich and SpinSucks. She helps clients, SpinSucks students, and professionals in the PR Dream Team use communications to drive real business results. Thanks for joining, Laura.
Thank you.
And co-hosting with Laura is Jen Zingsheim Phillips, the Director of Marketing Communications for CARMA. She has worked in communications and public affairs for more than 20 years and brings a decade of experience in digital and social communication and media monitoring and analysis to her role at CARMA. Thanks for being here, Jen.
Thank you.
For those of you listening, there'll be a period at the end for questions, so I invite you to submit any questions you may have throughout the session in the chat box at the bottom of the control panel. Also, today's session is being recorded, and that recording will be available on CARMA's YouTube channel. So I'm going to hand it over to Laura and Jen now to talk about analyzing data and extracting insight to make better decisions.
Thank you so much, Jordan. Okay, well, logically, for a program that discusses analyzing data, we're going to start with data. And, I know just from the work that I've done at CARMA and the work that I've done for other customers and clients throughout my entire career, we are not at a loss for data. It's everywhere. We have, our email clients give us open rates and all kinds of statistics. We have Google Analytics now. We have content from our social platform, Social Insights. So we're basically awash in data. And it's taking the time to look at that information rather than just generating reports and at, week's end, quarter's end, year's end, and hoping someone else can derive some insight from it because, quite frankly, we're exhausted just pulling it together in the report. So, Laura, why don't you kick us off and let us know a little bit about your perceptions of finding data?
Well, I think you're absolutely right, Jen. We are flooded with data and really great data, but we're so busy trying to, get everything together, run campaigns, pull together reports that we're not using it to actually make our jobs easier and to be more effective. So communicators often will do one of three things when it comes to data. They will either say, okay, I've got this data, I've got to use it. And so they'll go into Google Analytics or their CRM and email management system, and they'll look at the data. And they wait really patiently looking at the data, hoping that some magic insight and psychic power is going to come out of this data. So that is the psychic approach to data analysis. The other way that they use it is that they say to themselves, I'm pretty sure that this is what's happening with our program, or this is why we're not, accomplishing our goals. We're not driving leads. We're not converting people. So they'll go into that data to confirm their assumptions, to basically reinforce their bias. And then the third way that they use it is that they go into data, they look for trends, they slap it on a report, and they say, oh, look, our blog is continuing to drive more visitors, and we're getting more people from our social channels. But they're just looking at trends and really not looking at what those trends mean, where opportunities are, where they can turn, the understanding there into action. So those are the three most common ways that communicators use data. Whereas where the real opportunity lies is to use it for data-based decision-making and really looking at how they can drive their organizations, their clients' goals by what data is telling them is effective, is not effective, and what their eventual buyers are, what's working for them, what they're doing, and what's making them actually convert into leads, prospects, or customers, buyers. So that is kind of the state of the union when it comes to data right now, and the way that we need to look at things from a different perspective.
Exactly. And I would add one additional component to that is that when we're talking about finding data, we really need to make sure that the data sets we are pulling match what we want the business outcomes to be. So
Right.
if you have, if you're, it's actually pretty straightforward if you're, selling something. You're selling widgets. A lot of your business goals are going to be tied back to sales. So that's a pretty straightforward one. So in addition to all of your, Google Analytics and your social platform information, you're going to need to look at sales data. But for other programs that maybe aren't so, directly tied to, selling X, Y, or Z or a widget, say you're in public affairs and your goals and objectives are to make sure that more people in a given area are aware of an upcoming ballot initiative. That's going to be a little bit more tricky to make sure that you're not going to wait until after the vote necessarily.
Right.
You want to know that your process
Right.
is in place and that you're making headway before that vote happens. So you're going to have to make sure that you have other information, the data that can help you in front of you. So it's not necessarily sales data in this case. It might be polling data. It might be survey data. It might be looking at, the amount of coverage that you're receiving, whether or not that's changing in tone. So be very expansive in how you consider the data that you're trying to collect.
Such a good point. And I think that really points to, hey, before you even start looking at data, you need to nail down what your goals are. So goals drive strategy, and data helps you understand how to focus that strategy. So such a good point. Your goals are going to be individual to you. And so how you use data to understand what drives them will also be individual to you.
Exactly. Okay. So I think we're ready for the next slide, Jordan. Okay, so get creative with analysis. That doesn't mean you make things up. Getting creative with your analysis means making sure that you look at things with a fresh perspective. And, a lot of times we can get very locked into, okay, our goal is to expand our the number of people that know us in XYZ area. So you get very fixated on looking at those numbers rather than looking at what else might be contributing to movement in those numbers. So again, my background is public affairs, and believe it or not, when you look at participation rates in things like town halls, weather is a factor. So if you are looking at a long-term project and you say, oh my goodness, we had absolutely nobody at this town hall, we must have gotten the messaging wrong, that might not be the case. You should also look at other things that might be affecting your data. So when I say get creative with your analysis, I mean make sure that you're looking at a full, complete view, and look at it with a fresh set of eyes. Like, don't get locked into your common reporting mindset, and it's very difficult to break out of. But every time we have an aha moment, it's almost always when we're not staring at what we need to be solving.
Right. Right. I think that, the fact of research in general is that you can confirm anything you want to if you go in with an assumption. So it's really easy to take any type of data that you get and conform it to your assumption. So you need to start with more of take away the assumption of what's going on and be really open in your perspective of how you approach data. So look at it based on questions instead of how you feel, like what you feel the situation is, or what preconceived ideas you have about why something did or did not work. Because to your point, Jen, if you have those ideas at all and you don't remove them from the situation, you're just going to go directly to confirm or deny your idea. And in the process, you lose all these other data points that you could be looking at that will help you figure out what actually happened. So that narrow viewpoint is not, if you only look at, it's sort of like if you zoom way into a photo, you're going to get a really different idea of what that photo is about versus if you zoom out and you see the whole photo in totality. So you want to zoom out from your situation and look at it in totality, and then you can start zooming in a little bit more into different sections that you investigate to see how you bring that whole picture together.
Exactly. And when we look at comparing, different data sets, sometimes, depending on how long you've been collecting data, sometimes you might be asked for something. Maybe somebody's asking you, well, what went on with our sales during the last quarter? How did PR affect that? How did our communications firm affect this? But sometimes if you look at a longer stretch of time, if you go back a year or 2 years, if you have that data, you can get a more well-rounded perspective of what might be happening. And this applies not only to, sales data, but it also applies to nonprofits and public affairs, depending on what, again, going back to organizational goals. So I have a kind of a personal anecdote, and I'm curious as to whether or not this nonprofit ever figured out what was going on with this because of the way that they collected data. So my husband, my mother-in-law, and I always used to go to this one big fundraising. My husband would cycle the 100 miles, and my mother-in-law and I would volunteer, and it was great. We all had a wonderful time doing this year after year until one year when they had so many volunteers, and every nonprofit, this seems like the dream situation, right? You have too many volunteers, but
Right.
we had literally nothing to do. They're like, can you go and hold this, ring this bell? And I'm like, okay, I'm spending an 8-hour day to ring a bell for 10 minutes. So we decided that we weren't going to bother going back the following year. Now, this organization was very good about collecting data for the cyclists that participated, because of course that's where the money was, right? They cycled. They're the ones that raised the money and went out and got what are they called, contributions and sign up and all that other stuff. So they'd ask the cyclists everything, how was the food? Was everything okay? Was your changing room okay? All of these questions. They never surveyed the volunteers. So they have no idea why some of their volunteers dropped off. And by the way, my mother-in-law and I weren't the only two that kind of stood around saying, we don't need to be here. If you're going to invest an entire day to travel to another state to volunteer for something, you need to have something for those folks to do. So I wonder, A, if their volunteer numbers dropped. I suspect they did. And B, if they ever had any idea why. So you have to make sure that you are collecting the right data in the first place, but maybe looking over a longer period of time would help glean some of that insight. Maybe they could get clues as to, okay, we've had this number this year, this number this year. What happened that year? Why are we dropping? Right. And they start asking the why questions, and maybe they get to the answer.
Right. Showing trends over time and changes over time help you kind of set a base point as far as what's your norm, where did things change, and then how did that change. Recently, we were working with a client, and they've really been struggling with their social media to have it be effective, to drive their goals. And we look back a couple of years, and their social media is actually, the conversion rate of their social has actually decreased by has cut in half from what it was 2 years ago. Whereas they're working more, they're doing more stuff on it, they're spending more time, they've invested in more. And so then we started drilling down, okay, well, where are the differences? Is there something in the industry that has changed? Is there something from a voice perspective that has changed? Is there something as far as what channels we're focusing on that's changed? And we ended up figuring out that it was the different voices that they were using on different channels. And so they found a voice that worked really well on Twitter, but it wasn't as effective for their other social channels, but they just transferred it over there and did kind of that cut and paste. Okay, we've got all these social channels, we're everywhere, we're gonna talk to everyone across the social channels, but they weren't thinking about how their community was using those other social channels. So just because they had a certain audience on Twitter, it wasn't that same audience on Facebook, and they didn't want to interact with them on the same way on Facebook as those people on Twitter might. And that was really where the struggle was. And we wouldn't have figured that out unless we started looking at how the different social networks were driving engaged and active people, and those conversion rates and engagement across time, and started to see where those, you could very clearly see when that decision was made, how the social channels started changing and how that data was affected. So you really have to look at trends, understand the bigger picture of the world, the environment, the economy, politics, business, everything you work in, because while you are in your little microcosm of your organization, you're working within a larger space where your consumer and your prospect is affected by a lot of different things. So have that wide perspective about how things are affecting what you do, because everything works together.
Exactly. Okay, I think this is a perfect segue into one of the brand examples, I think, that is out there. So Jordan came across this piece in The Drum, which is an industry publication online, and it was a big discussion about the Kate Spade brand, and I believe that this was presented at South by Southwest. So Kate Spade used to do exactly what Laura was just discussing. They take one piece of content, they were on a whole bunch of different social channels, they take that content and spread it across all of them, and they had all of this data, where people were clicking on links and where they were, seeing the posts or interacting maybe sometimes on Twitter, but no real insight as to what was driving any of that activity. So what they did was they really kind of stripped it down and stepped back. They decided, not to be on every social channel, which I think is a smart and very brave thing for them to do. Or actually, it's not even necessarily not to be there, but they decided where they wanted to prioritize their resources. So that was the first thing that they did. And then they really looked at a lot of different data points. And what was most remarkable to me about this story was that they were not exclusively driven by demographics. Now, something where you see a brand like this, where you're selling something and they really want to capture the attention of the millennials who are out there spending money and whatnot, the normal behavior of a brand is to say, okay, where is that audience? And it's a very fair and logical thing to do. But what Kate Spade did was that they didn't just look at the demographics and where are they. They also looked at, is this channel right for us? They decided not to do Snapchat, which seems like one of those completely counterintuitive things. That's where millennials and Gen Z are, and that's who they want to be cultivating as, brand purchasers. But they decided it wasn't a good fit for showcasing their product. They said it was very, snappy and on the fly, and that wasn't the right sales tool for their brand. They have a presence on Twitter, but don't, sink a lot of time into it. What they decided to do was focus on YouTube and use their brand to tell stories where they incorporate their products as part of the storytelling. And I just think that this is such a smart and fascinating way to take insight and turn it into action that actually leads to meeting and matching and exceeding sales and engagement goals.
I love this story so much. And, we were talking actually right before the webinar started about what's great about this and there's a lot of great lessons for communications pros here. And one of them is that data allowed them to be very specific in how and where they spent their time. And it also allowed them to have talking points when they talk to leadership, CEO, people who are out there saying, well, why aren't we on Snapchat? Why aren't we using Twitter? Why aren't we doing this? Data helps them be very clear in why they did what they did, what their actions were driving their goals, and why they weren't on certain places. It's often really hard for us when it comes to social, when it comes to content, when it comes to anything that we're doing and tactics that we're choosing to use to drive our goals, to narrow down and focus, both because it's exciting and great to like have the new shiny thing and want to follow those latest trends, and we read something and it's a great idea and we think, oh, like I'd love to try that. But at the same time, and we might also have like, our leadership or our clients saying, well, I was talking to this person, or my, fellow business owner or fellow friend said that they were on Snapchat and it was really effective for them. So why aren't we there? And that pressure, when we don't have data to back us up and to help explain our decisions, both in our own mind and for our client, for our C levels that we're reporting to, it's really hard to push back. So when, we use data in a way that gives us those explanations, we're focused in what we do. And we're also confident when we go and explain our strategy to other people because we've got numbers to back us up. So that's one thing that I love about this story. The other thing, and it goes back to what I was talking about with the client before, being able to see how different people use and what they want to see on your social channels is super powerful and super important because everyone is different. And if you try to use the same game for each channel, you're just not going to be as effective as you could be. So one thing that Kate Spade did was they worked with YouTube to figure out what things people were searching in YouTube when they wanted fashion and beauty advice. And so then they built content. They built YouTube videos around those things so they could be answering their prospects' questions right away. And had they not, done that research, looked through what was going on, looked through the data, and figured out, hey, YouTube's a great place for us, and our audience is looking for these things, then all those videos, all that content, they could have been producing it and it wouldn't have been effective. But they were able to make their time efficient, make their budget efficient, and focus in on what worked versus what, kind of shooting at darts and what people thought they should do or what the industry was doing. They did what works.
Exactly. And this is also a great demonstration of how of the phrasing, be creative with your analysis.
Right.
They were creative in looking at, things beyond just the surface. I'm just still so impressed that they didn't get, we tend to get a little obsessive about demographics now that information is so readily available to us. And the fact that they said not just where is our audience, but who matters to our audience. Like they went and looked at, okay, who are the people that our audience, I don't want to say look up to, that's a little too pedantic, but who's capturing the attention of our audience? Right. And what are they doing? And they ended up with, some sly, sassy humor is kind of where they went. And okay, so how are they absorbing this content? Where are they finding it? They're finding it on YouTube. So they took different data elements in a creative way and applied it to their problem, and were able to develop an actionable solution.
What's really exciting for us about the data that we have right now is it allows us to be in a little bit of a Sherlock Holmes perspective and so put on our detective hat and really go through this process of figuring out how our audience thinks, what they want, and how we can best deliver that to them. And that's super fun. And I think often because we're just so pounded with data and demands in our life, and we're jumping from, one emergency often to the next as communicators, taking a step back and looking at data from that really fun perspective of this puts me in just this really powerful, great detective role of figuring out how people think and looking behind so I can deliver what it is that our audience wants. and then have the numbers to back it up and say, this is why this is the right choice. So this is such a great example, and I definitely recommend everyone here, Google the Kate Spade YouTube videos and just take a look at what they're doing, because it's innovative, it's great, and it shows how different and detailed they were in looking at what really was going to work.
Yeah. Now, admittedly, this is a kind of an easy, almost too easy example. It's very neat and clean when you have a well-defined audience. Your goals are tied to sales. You're able to tell fun and compelling visual stories. You have a wide lifestyle product line. I mean, there are a lot of things about this that I understand aren't going to be necessarily directly applicable if you are in a less visual or more nuanced or highly regulated field. But you can still see how they took out of the box components and their data and came up with something that came up with a plan that moved them forward.
Right. Yes. And, I think that often it's really easy for us to make excuses that, we work in a boring field, or nobody really cares about this, or people aren't looking for this information. But actually they are. That's where the art of communication comes in. That's where, as storytellers and as communicators that are looking for these things, we have to be creative. We have to look and not make those excuses of putting ourselves in a box that the rest of our industry might put themselves in, because there are many ways, even if you work in a regulated industry or a really boring one, that you can take the stories that are there and the things that people are, looking for, because they're looking. You just have to answer. You just have to be there to respond. So while Kate Spade is definitely, a princess kind of example, and it's Kate Spade. I mean, it's a fun company and they have a big budget. As a communicator with a smaller budget, with a boring brand, like, you can do this same thing. Just don't let yourself be boxed in. That's the handcuffs that you never want to put on yourself, is saying, I can't do that because this is my situation. Because as soon as you tell yourself that you're in a certain box, you're going to take out you're going to narrow your view, so you can look at all the data in the world and you're going to only confirm your own bias. So make sure you just stay open and creative about what's possible, because it is possible for your brand. There's no exceptions to this rule. This type of stuff can work for you. Just be open to it.
Exactly. And that's a great segue for our next slide.
Hey. Okay. So this is really, and I touched upon this a little bit at the beginning and talking about the ways that communicators use data. But really, it's one of the biggest things that we have to be aware of. You can look at this in just our general pop culture. How many studies have you seen that have come out and been all over the news about the same thing, but they come to completely different conclusions? So it's like, 1 week, bacon is so good for you. The next week, bacon is killing you. And it's the same. I mean, it's still bacon. Like, bacon doesn't change week to week, but how the perspective that you analyze the data from is going to tell you, it's going to confirm or deny your assumption. So you want to go into data really making data-driven decisions, whereas we go in open-minded and ask it questions, but don't go in with preconceived notions, versus going into data to confirm our bias or to just have it tell us that we're right, basically. And Jen definitely touched upon this when talking about being creative and knowing that, and making sure you're looking at the right data sets and you're open to that. So that's one of the biggest things. Always ask yourself, when you look at data and it either does or does not tell you what you want, am I coming in with an assumption, or am I actually open to what this might tell me? And sometimes that's really hard, because as communicators, we tend to have things like, tactics and techniques that we really like to do. And the fact of the matter is that sometimes in certain situations, those tactics just aren't going to work well. And it's often devastating when you feel so confident that this is going to be huge and it's going to, get the word out and, accomplish whatever your goals. And you go into the data and you see that it's totally bombed. And so you'll start making excuses around it. Like, well, it would have worked. However, this was the situation, or, this, and you nitpick when actually it's just that the tactic didn't work. And that's okay. That's why we have data to figure it out. So, be really clear and honest with yourself of, are you making decisions based on data, or are you making assumptions that you're asking it to confirm? And I think that's good for the next slide too.
And another reason that this is so important is if you are looking at your data with an assumption and saying, well, it didn't happen because of X, Y, and Z, you're not going to be able to course correct if you need to. And that's where, you really kind of get in trouble, and you use the same strategy or the same tactics and just assume that, whatever rationale you applied to it last time isn't going to exist this time, therefore it will work, and then it doesn't again, and then you're really in trouble.
Right.
So making sure that you have that kind of distance from your data, like, channel your inner doctor, your Mr. Spock, be very, very, straightforward and just stare at the data. It's really the best way to approach your analysis. And it can be tough. It's really tough.
It's super tough because we're so connected to what we do, and it's so hard not to take it personally. So the data has nothing against you as a human, and it really believes that you are a good communicator. So you just have to, this just maybe was not the best course. And so it's helping you use your communication skills and your strategy skills to realign and find an effective course of action.
Exactly. Okay, so questions lead data analysis. I love this because this is how actually you're able to take that step back. If you approach your data asking questions rather than coming at it and saying, okay, here's what I expect, that's when you can start deriving the actual value from it.
Exactly. So, have an idea of, idea that you need to address, a question that you need to answer, and go to the data with that question. That helps you remove a lot of that assumption. So are people engaged that come from mobile? What's the behavior pattern of people that come from Facebook versus those that come from our on-site content? What time of day do people most like to interact with our social channels? Have questions that help you understand how things are working better. And it makes you use your time looking at data very effective, because you're not just going in and looking at it like a magic 8-ball and hoping that it will give you the right answer, but you're not exactly sure what question you want it to answer. Or you're not going in just looking at trends and kind of blindly trying to figure out what they mean. You're very specific in your ask. So when you communicate often that feel overwhelmed by data, it's because they're not going in with specific questions. They're just going in trying to absorb it all at once. And you can't. You just don't have the time or the really reason to do it. You need to go in with a goal. So I'm going to figure out what this is. What's the answer to this question? Why is this not working? How do I make this better? And then use that to guide you in how you search through your data and what you look at even.
And one of the tips that I would offer, and this can be hard, especially if you're in your data often, is try and have those questions written down before you look at your data.
Yes.
Because
absolutely.
If you sit down and say, okay, what do I want to know without looking and without staring at the data, then you're going to have it kind of keeps you on task. Now, this sort of counteracts my, other point, which is to be kind of open and creative when you're looking at your data. That requires you to kind of look at a lot of different things, a lot of different places, and be open to maybe atypical answers or atypical questions. But I don't think that they're necessarily exclusionary. One doesn't exclude the other. If you sit down, you write down your list of questions that you must have answered, as you dig and as you answer those questions, you will find yourself, I think, looking at your data in a different way and saying, well, those questions will lead to other questions if you don't come at it with an assumption.
Absolutely. In fact, when you write those questions down ahead of time, and that is an excellent tip and absolutely something you should do, you tend to, as you're following that trail to find an answer, you tend to go into areas that you probably wouldn't have ever thought about going into before. I know that happens to me all the time. I'll go in with a question and I'll start where I think I can find the answer. But then when I look there, that gives me something that kind of gives me another question that I need to answer before I can answer the big question. And so I think that actually, not only are those two things, the creativity and the questions, not mutually exclusive, they support one another because the questions help guide you into areas you probably wouldn't have thought about before, as long as you're open-minded with those questions and how the data could answer them. So great tip.
Okay, so that brings us to what questions do you ask? So this is, a super important, as we've just outlined, part of this process. And you want to walk through these, Laura? You pulled this together, so.
Yes, definitely. So if anyone has ever seen Andy Crestodina of Orbit Media talk about applied analytics, it's a great talk and it will really help frame how you think about data in a lot of ways. One of the things he talks about is the process of going from question to answer to action, and then that action that you apply to strategy, you're going to want to measure that and go back with another question to your data. So that process, I think, is really a great clear-cut way for you to keep your analysis very efficient and effective and focused. So you want to ask a question, you want to go to data to find an answer to that question. That answer should lead to an action for you that you're going to apply to your strategy or adjust your tactics with. Then you want to measure that action. How does that move the dial? Does that change things? Does that improve things? Does that help you get closer to your goals? Go back to the data to find that, and then you keep working through that process. This allows you to just continue to refine what you do, become more effective and more successful in pursuing those goals, because you have numbers to back you up and show you if you're on the right path or how you need to tweak. So, as you're kind of getting in there, going through the data, always go through this process. You don't want to just keep asking questions and not ever have it result in an action, because that's not the great thing about data is that when you act on something, you can see how that works or doesn't work. So always have a goal. Like, I'm going to ask a question, here's the answer I find, and from that answer, I'm making an action that will help further inform, what's working or get us closer to our goals.
Exactly. And I think that the one kind of component here that might be slightly something that people need to consider is something that Chris Penn went into in discussion he had with the Measurement Standard, which is a publication we have, is knowing, making sure you know who the person is that can help you apply an action if that's a need. So that's going to be more applicable in a larger organization than a smaller one. But if you are in charge of, pulling together data analysis and doing this sort of, pulling this, asking the right questions, but you don't have the authority to take that answer and turn it into an action, then making sure that you know who you need to work with and make sure that that connection is made so that you can, sometimes it's internal lobbying, or maybe it's, just using data to get other departments on your team to help you turn it into an action. You aren't always going to have complete control over the entire process, I guess is what I'm saying. And so knowing who you need to go to is also part of making sure that you have an effective plan to approach your data.
Great point. That's such a good tip.
Oh, and this is what we were just talking about.
Yeah, this is what we were just talking about. So here's a visual of what we were just talking about with pretty circles for you. But I think it just really helps you understand that, that cycle of that's what's great about data. It's this ongoing cycle of just continuing to get better. Questions, answers, actions, evaluate, and that circles you right back to questions. And you slowly just, are able to target in, refine, focus, and get better every day at what you do and the strategy that you're pursuing.
Yep, and it helps prove the value, of course, of your communications work, which is something that we all know is important. And taking this and applying it to what you're doing and your measurement strategies and monitoring strategies and will help you become not only a better communicator, but help your organization reach their business goals.
That's such a great point. And I think that's something that, as part of this is really important to talk about, is that data not only allows us just in what we do be better, but it also allows us to have a seat at the table when it comes to the organization and really moving the dial and helping our organization, our leaders, our C-levels, our board, members, whatever format that you work in, understand how communications affects business goals, because data is what shows that. And Dietrich obviously talks about PR metrics, and those things are how you're going to really be able to have a seat at the table and have more involvement in the decisions that are made, in what's being said, in how the organization even kind of operates that helps you push goals forward and work from a communications perspective. So this is really important data is really important, and understanding how it works and how it affects things is so important for what you do, but it's also important for how you help your organization understand your role. It gives you a lot more power to be part of those bigger conversations and show your value as a communicator.
Exactly. And sometimes you might even need to go back and collect a different set of data, like my example at the beginning of that nonprofit that didn't survey volunteers. Right. I mean, that's, it's one simple thing that they could do and could help them understand changes, but until they have that piece of information, they might not have the answers that they might not be able to find the answers that they need to find. So.
Right.
Sometimes
exactly.
It points to holes that you need to fill, I guess.
Right. That's a good point. Yeah, sometimes it just shows you what you don't know yet, which is equally as important.
Yep. Okay. Well, I think that brings us to the Q&A section of this. So, Jordan, I will pop it back to you.
All right. Thanks, guys. That was really informative. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about quantitative versus qualitative data and how you can use both to kind of gain the insight that you need.
Quantitative versus qualitative. Do you want to take this one, Laura, or do you want me to?
That's a great question. Jen, why don't you start and then I'll follow up.
Sure. So I think the first thing we need to do is a super high level definition of quantitative versus qualitative. And quantitative is stuff you can count. These are the numbers and information that you can directly collect. And qualitative is the kind of more nebulous. It's talking to customers and getting feedback. So to me, the best example of a combination of quantitative and qualitative would be a survey that gives you a whole bunch of response buckets that say how was your experience, rate from 1 to 5, and a bunch of questions like that. And then the open-ended buckets or questions at the end that say, can you tell us more about your experience? Or you answered 1 to the previous question. That's a lousy response. What happened? What was wrong? So it allows you to add that qualitative open-ended information. So why are they both important? Well, quantitative helps point you to the questions. Qualitative can help you sometimes start to answer them, I guess is the way that I kind of look at that.
That's a great way to put it. Yeah. Yeah. I think that they're both important. And, you know, if you're able to get, sometimes the quantitative, it helps you start in the right direction, and the qualitative helps you further refine your information around that. So especially in certain situations that you might be able to see what's happening from just the numbers, from the data. But in order to get that extra perspective and a little bit more detail, the qualitative data helps you fill in some of those spaces, some of those holes that might still be in the fabric of the question that you're trying to answer.
Exactly. And I guess this reminds me of a piece that I was reading not too long ago, but Jeff Bezos from Amazon was saying that, you know, he reads emails that they get from customers because, and he says that, and he made a very interesting point, which kind of raised my eyebrows, but he says that sometimes if he's pushed to pick between the metrics and some of the customer feedback is almost always right. So yeah, I thought it was fascinating, because you can get too locked up sometimes in numbers and you don't realize it, but you are layering your own mental information or what you know about something onto those numbers. So if you have a whole bunch of metrics that say, well, the reason that people aren't finishing this purchase is because the button's in the wrong place, and meanwhile you have other people saying, well, no, the coupon code just didn't work. Who are you going to believe? The button in the wrong place or the coupon code not working? I would go with the people saying the coupon code didn't work. Now, there's probably metrics. That's a sloppy example. It's all I could come up with on the fly. But when I read that, and I had to go back and read it a couple of times, because Amazon is such a data-driven organization, but they don't let it take over, apparently. They make sure that they pay attention to that qualitative information.
Well, and you know, in the end, we're all humans, and so sometimes sometimes the quantitative data is not able to show us some of that human component. So when you have that qualitative that you're able to layer and make decisions, then it just makes it that much more helpful. And Jen, you know, to your point, you're so right. We have to, whenever we're looking at data, we have to understand that we have bias. We're always going to come in with bias. And so anything that we can do to remove that will be helpful. At the same time, be careful. You know, it's finding that perfect balance, because at the same time, you do need to be careful about qualitative data that can drive you from an emotional perspective more. And understand that sometimes people are going to, especially when it comes to digital communications, or if they're, you know, anonymous or whatnot, they'll say things that they maybe, you know, are exaggerated, or they wouldn't really say anyways, or they just want to say something to say something. So finding that perfect balance and making sure both are sort of backing things up and make sense together is the perfect mix. So don't, you know, disregard one for the other if they're not matching up. That's when you just have to say, all right, I need to start looking for another data point someplace that can help me understand what the real situation is.
Exactly.
Thanks. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about obstacles and the common obstacles that communicators encounter when they're trying to analyze data and glean insight from that data, and how can communicators overcome those obstacles?
Oh boy, number one is it's got to be time. I think
time. I agree. Time. You know, I think that is above and beyond the biggest one, because we have great intentions, but we just we say we're gonna jump in there, we're gonna get it. And that's why a lot of what we went over today is so effective, because it helps you go in and just say, all right, I have, I would start small, start making data a habit. So that's going to be what's really going to have to change kind of the way you interact around it. So say, I'm not making strategy decisions unless I consult the data. And so the time that I would put into making assumptions and sort of just like going around and wondering, I'm going to put that into just looking at the data, and give yourself a time frame. Say every Friday at the end of the week, I'm going to just spend an hour. I'm going to spend an hour, lay out all the questions that I have from some things, and go into the data and find answers and make decisions. No more than an hour. That's all I have. If I have more questions that I can't get done in that hour, I'm going to save them until next week. So if you give yourself a really set time frame and schedule it in like a meeting, because this is as important, if not more important, of any meeting that you would take, schedule it in like a meeting. Say, I have an hour each week that I'm going into data. I'm only spending that hour. After that hour, I'm done. Then it becomes a little bit more manageable, instead of just approaching it like this, vast desert of stuff that you need to wade through when you can't ever find the time. And the other thing is having the question, answer, action format helps you make that more, build that into what you're already doing more, because you're going to have to find answers and pursue actions anyways. So make your work more effective by actually having facts and data to help you direct that focus and figure out what you're going to do.
Okay, and then I'm going to jump in with another obstacle, which I think is especially prevalent among mid to senior level PR professionals and communicators, which is just, the availability and access to training and understanding all of the different data sources. I think that, a lot of us are perfectionists by nature. That's why we get into this. We like being able to craft messages and work with people to get things right. And it can be very scary to be slammed into a situation where you're getting multiple data streams that used to be someone else's responsibility, and you're now being told, apply this to PR and communications and prove to me that you're worth the money we're spending on this department. That it can be overwhelming in and of itself. And if you don't know or haven't been trained and don't know what you're looking at, it becomes almost an insurmountable obstacle. I am here to tell you there are lots of free resources. Google them. Yeah. And I will also tell you that, if you have a question, ask somebody. I think as PR people, we are kind of conditioned to be expected to know all the answers, and it's just not possible with the amount of data, information, the number of different platforms out there, the number of different, the data landscape is so fractured that anyone who tells you they know everything about measurement data is pulling your leg. There's just too much out there. So get used to feeling uncomfortable, I guess, is the best way to put it, and ask the questions if you need help. That's what, friends love to help you out. They do. Just let down that guard and ask.
Yes, great point.
Great, thank you. So earlier, Laura, you made the example of the studies, and one day they say bacon is good, and then another study is saying that it's not good. So I was wondering, based on that kind of example, how would you say you would build a fluid decision-making process if data conclusions are constantly changing?
I think it comes to really being aware of the bias that you might have. So you can look at data and interpret it however you want. And that's why we really recommend going in with a question and trying to have an open slate. So be a clean slate. Try to remove yourself from the data. And it's so hard because you have a little bit of a curse of knowledge. You know what you want to work. You know what you feel like maybe from experience you should work. So instead of going in, that's why that question perspective really helps you, because instead of going in and just looking at things, and when you just go in kind of looking to figure something out, you're naturally going to look at data that is going to confirm your bias, and you can mold it to fit. But instead, when you go in and ask questions, it helps you remove yourself a little bit more. So that's the biggest thing I would do, is just, go in with an open mind, ask questions. And back to Jim's earlier point, read a lot of stuff. Like, there's a ton of resources out there about, data and how to pursue it. Actually, I think between the two of us, we mentioned 3 really great ones: Chris Penn, Andy Crestodina, Ginny Dietrich. Anything that those 3 people, they've written a ton of stuff about metrics and data and how to look at different things. And there's many more resources out there, but to get you started as well, like, look at how people are looking at things and suggestions about data to analyze, and how to analyze it, and questions you might want to ask. And that helps remove a lot of that bias that you have, because you're learning something new. And when you learn something new, you don't have preconceived notions around it, because it's fresh, it's new. You're getting in there and forming kind of how your brain works around it.
Great, thank you. All right, so it looks like we might have time for one more question. So you talked a little bit earlier about using data to self-correct. So I was wondering if you could talk about that a little more. If you're finding shortcomings in your data, how do you use that data to kind of self-correct for the future?
Ooh, that's a really good question. And, this is to me, this is measurements like biggest vacuum point, because we are so pressed for time. We generally look at data as something that we have to report on for specific endpoints. During the intervening time periods, say you're working with a client and you've got a client report due every other week, with a wrap-up report at the end of each quarter. So you're in the weeds doing the work for the client. 2 weeks in, you're like, oh no, I've got that report that's due close of business Thursday. You quick slam all of the data into the pre-approved format that the client has requested, and it has a whole bunch of input data rather than any outcomes information, or maybe there's a handful of outcomes information. You don't take the time to step back from it because you don't have the time to step back from it. Then at the end of the program, you look at everything and say, oh, this particular region was performing spectacularly well in Q1. I wonder what happened. You go back, you have the time now to look at it, and you're like, oh, they were doing things a little bit differently. If we had noticed that earlier, we could have applied it to, other regions, and it would have turned this whole program around. So it really is a missed opportunity if you're not kind of looking at your data on an ongoing and regular basis. So how do you do that? Well, first of all, you need to make sure that your baseline was established correctly. You need to make sure that you have the right measurement protocols in place, and you need to be able to ask the right questions each time you look at the information and data. So I would say the ability to course correct is going to depend on the amount of time that you're able to look at the data from an analytical perspective rather than a reporting perspective.
Yeah,
perfect.
I agree completely.
All right, so we're just about at our hour mark, so I think we're going to wrap it up for today. Our host's email addresses are here, as well as CARMA's website and Twitter handles. So if you have any additional questions or just want to connect, that information is there. As mentioned previously, the recordings of the session will be available on CARMA's YouTube channel, and the slide deck will be available on our SlideShare account. So I want to thank our hosts again for a really informative session, and I want to thank our attendees for joining us today. We hope to see you at future CARMA webinars. Thanks. Have a good day.